3 Apache women found a wounded cowboy, and now by sacred law he must be their husband. The bullet was still in me when they found me. Not deep, I knew that much. I dug at it some before I passed out, which is probably why there was so much blood. The slug had gone in below my left shoulder blade and stopped somewhere near the rib, and I'd used a skinning knife on myself in the dark like a damn fool, which only made the hole bigger and the bleeding worse. By the time the sun came up, I was propped against the base of a dry wash, my horse gone, my canteen empty, and the flies already finding me. That's where they found me. 3 Apache women coming back from wherever they'd been. I didn't hear them coming. I didn't hear anything until a shadow fell across my face, and I opened my eyes, and there were 3 of them standing there looking down at me the way you look at something you're not quite sure is alive yet. I want you to understand what I looked like at that moment. I was 39 years old, which doesn't sound that old until you consider I'd spent most of those years outside in the sun and wind, and about half of them getting hit by various things. I had a beard that hadn't been trimmed since Tucson. I was wearing a shirt that had been white at some point in its life. I had dried blood from my left shoulder all the way down to my belt on one side, and trail dust caked into the blood so it was more like a crust than a stain. My hat had blown off somewhere in the night. My boots were still on, which I considered my one accomplishment. The 3 of them stood there looking at me. I said in what I thought was a reasonable voice, "I'm not dead." The oldest one, a woman I'd put at maybe 55, small and compact, with silver threading through her black hair and a face that had seen everything and made peace with most of it. She said something to the other 2 that I didn't catch. Then she looked back at me and said, in English that was better than I expected, "Not dead yet." Which was fair. I'll tell you who they were, because it matters for everything that came after. The older woman was Natty. That's what I'll call her, which is close enough to what I came to call her later. She was the aunt, the elder of the 3, the one with authority, and she carried it the way certain women carry weight, not by pushing it at you but by never losing it themselves. She had been married twice and was widowed twice, which in that country and that time wasn't unusual, just hard. She was the one who made decisions. The widow was Dessa, which again is close enough. She was maybe 30, a few years younger than me. Her husband had been dead about a year, killed in a raid that wasn't even meant for their camp. Wrong place, which is a poor way to die but a common one. She had a son, 6 years old, who I didn't see that first morning because he'd been sent ahead to the main camp with a bundle of something while the 3 women were coming back. She was tall for an Apache woman, quiet in the way that some people are quiet because they've learned that speaking costs something, and they've become careful about the spending of it. The 3rd was Dessa's younger sister, Leela. 19, maybe 20. Still had some fire in her that the country hadn't ground down yet. She was the one who looked at me like I might be a problem, which was perceptive of her, and which I respected even at the time. 3 women, alone, somewhere in the territory between the mountains and the flats, in country I knew a little and trusted less. They didn't leave me there. I've thought about that moment 1,000 times in the years since, and I still can't tell you exactly why. They had no obligation to me. I was a stranger, a white man, bleeding in a wash in country that white men had spent 30 years making worse for everyone who already lived there. They could have walked past. They probably should have, by any reasonable accounting. But Natty said something to the other 2, and Leela made a sound that I would later learn was her version of agreeing while wanting it noted that she wasn't entirely happy about it. And Dessa crouched down next to me and put her hand on my forehead and looked at the wound on my back and didn't say anything at all. They made a stretcher out of 2 poles and a blanket. I know that because I helped drag myself onto it, which took everything I had. Then they carried me. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 3 women carried a full-grown man. I was 180 pounds even after the blood loss, across rough country for what I later figured was about 2 miles. Natty on one side of the poles, Dissa on the other, Leela out in front with her eyes on the ground. I drifted in and out. The sky above me was the color of old bone. I could hear my own breathing in a way that scared me some. They brought me to a camp that was small, 3 structures, really, more of a way station than a permanent settlement. There was a fire ring with a banked fire that Leela brought back up while Natty went to work on my back. I don't remember all of it. I remember the smell of something burning, not wood, something else, something sharp and medicinal, and Natty's hands, which were small and very certain. She had a way of doing things that didn't waste anything. No extra movement, no hesitation. She'd done this before. I remember Dissa's face at some point, close to mine, saying something quiet in Apache that I didn't understand. Her eyes were dark and steady. Not warm exactly, more like resolved. Like she'd decided I was worth the trouble, and having decided it, that was that. I woke up fully sometime that evening with my back stitched and bound, and a young boy sitting 3 feet from me staring like I was the strangest thing he'd ever seen, which I probably was. That was Dissa's boy, Calico, not his real name. I called him that later, after the pattern of his shirt, and it stuck. The law came up on the 3rd day. I was sitting up by then, weak but upright, which in my experience is the important thing. Natty had been bringing me a broth that tasted like tree bark soaked in creek water and probably saved my life, and Leela had been watching me with the specific suspicion of someone who has decided you're probably not dangerous, but hasn't ruled it out. Dissa moved around the camp with Calico and said little. On the 3rd morning, Natty sat down across from me and looked at me for a long time without speaking. I was getting used to that. She had a way of looking at a person that made you feel like she was reading something you hadn't written yet. Finally she said, "You know what you owe." I said I figured I owed them my life, which I said plainly because it was true. She shook her head, not like I was wrong exactly, more like I was only partway there. She explained it to me in pieces over the next hour, with Dissa translating some of it and Natty correcting the translations in a way that made clear she understood English better than she usually let on. The law, and she used that word specifically, law, not custom, not tradition, not suggestion. The law was this. When a woman of the people finds a man near death and brings him back from it, she has claimed something. The Apache have always understood that life is a thing you can give, and when you give it, it binds. 3 women had found me. 3 women had carried me. 3 women had kept me alive. I said carefully, "I hear that there's a law. I don't yet understand what the law requires." Natty said, "You know what a husband does." And I did. I wasn't a young man. I wasn't confused. I looked at Dissa, who was on the far side of the fire, not looking at me. I looked at Leela, who was looking at me with her arms crossed and her chin up in a way that meant she was watching to see how I handled this. I looked at Natty, who was watching me the way she watched everything, steady, patient, already knowing which way the river was going to run. I said all 3. Natty said, "The law is the law." I sat with that for a while. I want to be honest with you about what I thought, because I think it's important. My first thought was not what you might expect. My first thought was, I have nothing. I had arrived in that wash with a horse that was gone, a saddle, a rifle that was also gone, a knife I'd used badly on myself, and a wanted poster somewhere in 3 counties that had my name on it attached to a crime I'd been part of but hadn't committed in the way they were saying I'd committed it. I had $11.30 in my vest pocket. I had a name that wasn't worth much, and a reputation that was worth less. These 3 women had carried me 2 miles and stitched my back and fed me tree bark soup and kept me alive. The law said I owed them a husband. I thought, what does a husband do? He provides, he protects. He fixes what's broken and hauls what's heavy and stands between the people inside his walls and whatever's outside them. He makes himself useful in the particular way that men are built to be useful, if they're any good at it. I thought about that, and I thought about the $11.30, and I thought about the wanted poster, and I thought about the horse that was gone. Then I said to Natty, "What does the law say about a man who has nothing?" She said, "A man who has nothing has only himself. That is enough to start." I said, "Then I'll start." It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, and nobody pretended otherwise. Sad didn't look at me that differently after the conversation with Natty. She was still the same quiet woman, still moved around the camp with the same economy of motion, still kept Calico close and spoke to him low, and kept her own counsel on most things. But there was something marginally different in how she moved around me, a fraction less space, a fraction more directness. Like she'd made a calculation and reached a number and was proceeding from the number. Leela was harder. Leela had opinions, and the opinions were that I was an unknown and unknowns were liabilities, and she wasn't wrong. She watched everything I did with the camp with a specific kind of attention, the kind that's looking for the thing that proves what it already suspects. I didn't mind that. I'd been watched that way before, and I knew that the only answer to that kind of watching is to give it nothing to find. I started with the wood. The camp used a lot of wood fire for cooking, fire for warmth at night, fire for the medical work Natty was always doing, boiling and steaming and burning various things. The wood pile was small. I wasn't in any condition to go hauling timber the first week, but I could split what was there, and I did. Slow at first, because the wound pulled when I twisted, but I found an angle that worked, and I split wood every morning for the first 5 days until the pile was 3 times what it had been. Nobody said anything about it. That wasn't the way of things in that camp. You didn't get praised for doing what needed doing. But Natty watched, and I knew she was watching, and that was enough. The water was worse than the wood situation. They were hauling it from a spring about a 1/4 mile through rough ground, and they were doing it in clay pots that were heavy when empty. I found a way to rig a carrying frame from poles and rawhide so 2 pots could be balanced across the shoulders, the way I'd seen it done in Mexico. It took me an afternoon to build and an hour of Leela watching me with skeptical eyes before she tried it and found it worked. She didn't tell me it worked. She just used it. But she stopped watching me like a problem for a while after that. There was a roof on the main shelter that leaked in 3 places. I fixed it. There was a pen for 2 goats they kept that had a bad post on one corner. I dug out the post and reset it. There was a place in the trail up to the spring where the ground had washed out and left a drop that was easy on the way up and treacherous on the way down with a load. I spent a day building steps in the bank with flat rocks. I am not telling you this to brag about the steps. I'm telling you because that is what the first month was for me, finding things that were hard and making them less hard. That's the work. Not dramatic, not heroic, just the long, dull, honest labor of being useful to people who need things done. Calico started following me after the 2nd week. He was 6, as I said, and he was curious the way 6-year-old boys are curious. Not carefully, not with any plan, just with his whole self, trailing behind at a respectful distance that got less respectful as the days went by. By the 3rd week, he was sitting next to me while I worked. By the 4th, he was handing me things before I asked for them, which means he'd been watching carefully enough to understand what came next in the sequence. I'd never spent much time around children. I didn't know what to do with him exactly. I did what I knew. I showed him things. How to set a post plumb, how to read water in dry ground, how to tie a knot that would hold under load. He absorbed it all with this absolute seriousness that was both touching and funny, the way children are sometimes, giving maximum gravity to things that will seem simple later. He called me something in Apache that I asked Dissa to translate. She thought about it for a moment and said, "It means something like the man who stays." I said, "Is that what I'm doing?" She said, "That is what he sees." Let me tell you about the threat, because there was a threat, and this is important. About 6 weeks after they'd found me, a man named Greer came to the camp. I knew Greer by reputation, not a good reputation. He ran a string of so-called claim operations in the territory, which was a polite way of saying he found people with something worth having and pressured them until they didn't have it anymore. He'd been working the Apache camps because some of the women there had land rights under a treaty that he had decided were better placed in his hands. He came with 2 other men, both of them the kind of men who work for someone like Greer, not smart, not stupid, just willing. He came on a Tuesday morning while I was up at the spring cutting out a new section of the water channel I'd been building slowly for weeks. By the time I got back down to camp, Natty was standing in front of her shelter with her arms folded and the expression of a woman who has been insulted and is deciding exactly how to respond. Dissa was behind her with Calico pressed against her side. Leela was off to the left, closer to the tree line, which meant she'd already thought about the geometry of the situation and positioned herself in it. Greer was making a speech about land rights and legal instruments and the benefits of accepting certain arrangements, which was the way he talked when he was getting ready to steal something. I came down the trail and stood next to Natty. Greer looked at me. I knew what he saw, a white man in a camp that was otherwise all Apache, which complicated the story he was trying to tell himself about the situation. He said, "Who are you?" I said, "I live here." He said, "You live here." I said, "That's what I said." He looked at the camp, the new roof, the wood pile, the water channel I'd been building, the post I'd reset on the goat pen. He was doing math in his head. He said, "You work for them." I said, "I'm the husband." The word landed differently than I expected, not on Greer, on me. Something in my chest settled when I said it. I'd been saying it to myself for 6 weeks, turning it over like a coin, and saying it out loud in front of this man who was trying to take things from people I'd decided I was not going to let take things from. It landed differently. It felt true. Greer said, "All 3 of them." I said, "Is that a problem for you?" He looked at me for a while. Then he looked at his 2 men, who looked back at him with the specific blankness of men who are waiting to be told what to do. Then he looked back at me. "I want to tell you I made some speech. I want to tell you I said something so exactly right that it sent Greer away changed. I didn't. I just stood there between him and the women behind me, and looked at him the way you look at a man when you are not going to move regardless of what he decides. Greer said, "I'll be back with papers." I said, "Bring a lawyer when you do, a real one. I've got a few things I want him to look at." He left. Leela came out of the tree line. She looked at me for a long moment, that measuring look she'd been using since the beginning, and then she said something in Apache. I looked at Dissa. Dissa said, "She says you stood right." I said, "What does that mean?" Dissa said, "It means what it sounds like." Greer came back twice more. He brought a man with papers the second time, and I spent 3 hours with those papers and found 2 things in them that were wrong and said so in terms that made clear I knew what I was looking at. I'd been a surveyor's assistant before everything went sideways for me, and I knew land documents. The third time Greer came, he came alone, and he came in the early morning, and he sat his horse at the edge of camp and looked at the place for a while and then rode on. We didn't see him after that. I won't say I wasn't watching for him. I was every day for months, but he didn't come back. What I didn't know for certain until I had time to sit down with what I'd found in those papers, was that the land the 3 women had rights to was worth more than Greer had understood. There was water on it. Not a spring like the one they were hauling from, but a real water source, underground, the kind that could feed a proper ranch in dry country. I'm not a water engineer, but I'd spent enough time in the territory to know what certain kinds of grass and certain kinds of rock and certain kinds of ground depression meant. I told Natty what I thought I'd found. She listened without expression through the whole explanation. Then she said, "I know." I said, "You knew about the water." She said, "My husband found it before he died." We did not tell anyone. I thought about that. I thought about this small woman with the silver in her hair who had been sitting on a water source worth real money in dry country, keeping it quiet for years, because she understood that the moment it was known there would be men like Greer and worse coming for it. She'd kept it quiet, and she'd kept her people small and unnoticed, and she'd survived on that strategy. I said, "Would you be open to changing strategy?" She said, "Tell me." Building a ranch is not a short story. I'm not going to tell you the whole of it as though it happened fast, because it didn't. The first year was the hardest thing I'd done since the war, and I'd done hard things in the war. We were in rough country, 3 women and a child and 1 man with a mended hole in his back, and $11.30 to begin with. The first real money came from the goats. I expanded the herd, traded labor to a Mexican rancher 2 valleys over for 4 more does and a buck, and Natty knew things about the animals that I didn't, knew how to keep them healthy in that climate, and what to feed them when the grass got thin. By the end of the first summer, we had a herd that was worth something. By the second summer, we were selling cheese and meat at the trading post 12 miles south, and the man there didn't love buying from Apache women, but he loved money more, and I handled the transaction in a way that kept things smooth. Leela was the one who worked out the trade routes. She had a mind for logistics that I recognized and respected, the instinct for where things were and how to move them, and what each leg of a journey cost against what it earned. By the second year, she was making decisions about what we brought to market and when, and making them better than I would have. I told her that. She received it without obvious pleasure, but I noticed she stood differently after that, a fraction straighter, a fraction more settled in herself. Calico grew. That sounds simple, but it was one of the things I watched most carefully. He grew into a boy who knew how to work, which is different from a boy who is made to work. He asked questions about everything, and I answered all of them I could, and told him plainly when I didn't know the answer, which he seemed to appreciate. He was 9 when he told me, seriously, that he was going to be a surveyor. I said that was a fine profession. He asked me to teach him everything I knew about it, and I did over the next several years, and he was better at it than I'd ever been. Dissa and I came to each other slowly. I want to tell this right because it matters. The law had made us husband and wife in the way the law named it, but that's not what we were to each other in the first year, or really the second. What we were to each other in the first year was people in the same struggle, which is its own thing and not a small thing. We worked beside each other every day. We ate together every evening. In the cold months, we slept in the same shelter because there was one shelter, and it was cold, and there was no reason to be cold separately when warmth is available. But there's a difference between being close to a person and knowing a person, and the knowing took time. She was not easy to know. The quiet that I'd noticed from the first morning was not coldness. It wasn't unfriendliness. It wasn't indifference. It was more like she had been hurt in ways that made her careful about where she put her weight. Her husband had been a good man, I understood, and his death had been sudden and senseless, and she'd had to rebuild her whole understanding of what the world was going to be, and that kind of rebuilding leaves marks. I didn't push. I didn't have a strategy. I just kept being present, kept being steady, kept doing what needed doing and showing up the next day to do it again. The moment I remember, the one that sits differently in my memory from all the others, was a night in the second winter. Bad cold snap, the kind that comes down out of the mountains and finds every gap in the walls and every thin place in the blankets. Calico was sick, not seriously, but feverish and miserable, and Dissa had been up most of 2 nights with him. I'd been up too, not every hour but checking, hauling water, keeping the fire from dying out, making the broth that Natty had taught me for fevers. On the 3rd morning, Calico's fever broke. He was sleeping properly for the first time in 2 days, and Dissa had finally let herself sit down beside him instead of hovering over him, and the cold had eased a little, and I came in from refilling the water, and she was sitting there with her son sleeping at her side, and her eyes closed and her hands in her lap. She heard me come in. She opened her eyes. I said, "He's better." She said, "Yes." I sat down on the other side of the fire because I was cold, and I needed to sit down. She said, without looking at me, "You didn't have to stay up." I said, "He's my boy." She looked at me then. I don't know exactly what my face was doing. I wasn't performing anything. I was tired and cold and glad the fever had broken, and I had meant what I said without thinking it through, which is the only way to say true things. She held my eyes for a long moment. Then she reached across and put her hand on mine, just for a moment, just long enough to be a thing, and then she took it back. That was it, that was all. But it was the beginning of something different, and we both knew it. I should tell you about the trouble with my past, because it came looking for me, and I had to deal with it. The wanted poster, the thing I mentioned at the beginning. The short version is this. 4 years before I ended up in that wash with a bullet in my back, I had been riding with a group of men who I thought were legitimate cattle drivers. They were not. Or rather, some of them weren't, and I found out which ones when they hit a payroll wagon outside of Prescott, and 2 men were killed. I had not participated in the hitting of the payroll wagon because I had been several miles behind with a lame horse, but I had ridden with the men who did it, and I had not turned them in, which in the law's reckoning made me a party to it. 2 of those men had been caught, and one of them had decided it would help him to name me. That was the poster. The man who came for me was a marshal named Cord, and he was not a bad man. I want to say that. He was doing his job, and his job was finding the men named on his list, and I was on his list. He found the ranch, found me, in the 3rd year. He came in the morning, which is when lawmen like to come. He was alone, which told me he was confident or had backup somewhere on the trail. He rode in slow and kept his hands visible, which told me he was a man who'd been in the territory long enough to know that riding in fast with your hands on your gun was how you got shot. I met him at the gate of what was by then a proper fence line, not fancy, but solid, posts I'd set myself and wire I'd strung over the better part of a summer. He said my name, my real name, which nobody in that camp had used in 3 years. I said, "That's me." He said, "I've got a warrant." I said, "I know what you've got, come inside." He looked at me, at the fence, at the buildings, at the smoke from the morning fire. I said, "Let me put some coffee on and tell you what actually happened at Prescott." He considered that. He said, "All right." We sat down at the table I'd built, a real table oak. Took me a week, and I told him the whole truth. The whole truth, including the parts that didn't make me look good, including the part where I had known something was wrong with the men I was riding with and hadn't acted on it. I told it all the way through. He listened without interrupting. He drank the coffee. He ate the bread that Natty brought without being asked, because Natty understood something about men and hospitality and what it could do. When I was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The man who named you, you know he's dead." I said I'd heard that. He said, "Changes the nature of the case somewhat." He looked around the room, at the table, at the straight walls, at Calico's school books stacked by the window, at Sam moving in the cooking area without hurrying. He said, "How long have you been here?" I said, 3 years. He said, "You run this place." I said, "We all run it, but I'm the one with the surveying knowledge and the fence posts." Something moved in his expression. Not sentimentality, just recognition, the kind a man has when he looks at something that was built properly and sees that it was built properly. He said, "I'm going to need a statement, written, signed, your account of what happened at Prescott." I said I'd write it that afternoon. He said, "I'll be back through this way in about 3 weeks. I'll pick it up then." He stood up from the table. He looked at me. 3 weeks is enough time to write a statement. I said, "It is." He looked at the table again. He said, "Good coffee." he wrote out. He came back in 3 weeks. He picked up the statement. He said the case was complicated and he'd need to take it back to Prescott and see where it went from there. I don't know exactly what happened in Prescott. He came back a 4th time about 4 months later, and he said the case had been reviewed and the charge had been reduced to a matter of being present with known criminals, which carried no criminal penalty if the man in question had since established himself as a law-abiding member of the territory. He handed me a paper. I read it twice. Then I looked at him. He said, "Nobody needs to be having this conversation again." I said, "Agreed." He shook my hand, which was something, and rode out. I stood there with that piece of paper for a long time, long enough that Dissa came out and stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her. She said, "Good news." I said, "Very good news." She said, "I'll tell the others." She didn't move for a moment. Then she put her arm around my waist, not tentatively, firmly, the way you hold onto something that belongs to you, and leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. I put my arm around hers. That was the first time. Standing in the yard in the morning sun, with a piece of paper in my hand that meant I had a future in this place. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Natty in the 4th year. The ranch was doing well by then, not rich but solid. We had 20 goats and 4 cattle and a vegetable garden that Dissa had expanded twice. Calico was 10 and spent his afternoons with me doing survey work and his mornings with Natty learning things I couldn't teach him. Leela had started trading with 2 other Apache camps in the region and was building something that looked like a small network of commerce. We had fixed the roof properly. We had dug the well. Natty and I were sitting outside in the late afternoon, the kind of slow hour before the evening meal when the light goes golden and the wind comes down from the mountains and everything smells like sage and cooling earth. She was working on something with her hands, always working on something, and I was just sitting, which was a thing I had learned to do in those years, just sit and be present in a place. She said without looking up from her work, "When you first agreed, did you agree because of the law?" I thought about it. I said, "Partly." She said, "What else?" I said, "Because you'd carried me, because I had nothing and nowhere to be, because I thought I could be useful." She said, "Not because of the women." I said, "Honestly, not at first. I didn't know the women." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now it's different." She looked up from her work then. She looked at me with those steady eyes that had always been reading something deeper than what I was saying. She said, "What is different?" I said, "Now it's mine, all of it. The place, the work, the boy. And they're mine too, all 3 of you, in the only way that counts, which is that I would not leave. Not for anything that's ever been offered to me, not for anything I could imagine being offered." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she went back to her work. After a while she said, "My first husband, he was a good man. My second was also good." She was quiet. I did not expect there to be more good men. I didn't say anything. She said, "The law said we had to keep you, but you had to become the reason for the law." She paused. "You understand?" I said I understood. She said, "Good." And she went back to her work, and I went back to sitting and watching the light go down over the mountains, and that was the whole of it. The 5th year was when Dissa and I had a daughter. I'm not going to spend a long time on this because it's the kind of thing that is hard to talk about without sounding like either a man who doesn't feel enough or a man who's performing feeling, and she was worth neither. I'll say that her name was a real name in Apache that meant something about water returning in the dry season, and I called her that name in both languages, and I learned to say it right. I'll say that Calico, who was 11 by then, took his role as elder brother with a seriousness that I'd already come to expect from him, and that watching him hold her the first time with that gravity, like he was being given a responsibility he intended to keep, was one of the things I've carried. I'll say that Dissa looked at me after the baby was born, not with softness exactly, which wasn't quite her way, but with something that meant more than softness, with recognition, with the kind of certainty that doesn't need to be said because it's been a long time solid. I'll say that Natty, who had been there for the birth, came outside afterward and told me the baby was healthy and Dessa was well, and then stood looking at the mountains for a while without speaking, and I stood next to her without speaking, and after a while she said, "Good work," in the way she'd said it every time something was built well or done right, which was the only praise she ever gave and therefore worth more than most. Leela brought us a goat. Just showed up the next morning with one of the young does, tied it to the fence post, and said it was for the baby's milk when the time came. Then she went back to her work. That was Leela. I'm in my 60s now. I'll not tell you exactly how far into them. Far enough that the mornings are harder than they used to be. And the back that Natty stitched up 30 years ago tells me about the weather before the weather knows what it's going to do. Natty has been gone 7 years. She went the way she went everything else steady on her own terms, one morning in the spring with the door open so she could hear the birds. I sat with her through the last night. There wasn't much to say and we didn't say much. She held my hand once, near the end, briefly, the way she'd always done things enough to mean it, not a moment more. Calico is a surveyor. A real one, with papers and instruments and a reputation in 3 territories. He comes back twice a year. He brings his wife, who is a woman from a town to the north with red hair, and a direct way of speaking that I think Leela taught her without knowing it. He brings his children, who are 4 in number and loud in the way that healthy children are loud, and who run the fence lines like they own the place, which in the way that matters they do. Leela married a man of her own people in the 6th year, a man who was good to her, which was all I'd ever asked for on her behalf. She still runs the trading network. It's larger now. She comes by on business and stays for supper and argues with me about prices in a way that means she respects me enough to bother. The girl, our daughter, is in a school now, in the town to the south. Her choice, which I helped make possible and which I am proud of even though the house is quieter for it. She writes letters every week. She has her mother's handwriting, which is careful and precise, and her grandfather's, Natty's husband, the one who found the water, which is the water I mean, the gift that was already there, waiting. Dessa and I have been together for 30 years. I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then I'll be done. About a year after Marshal Cord came and the warrant was settled, I was out at the east fence line doing some repair work on a section that the deer had found, and Dessa came out with water and sat down on the rocks nearby to watch me work. This was not unusual. She came out sometimes in the afternoons and watched me work, and I liked having her there in the way that you come to like a thing you didn't know you needed. She sat there for a while without saying anything. I was working and not expecting conversation. She said, "The women who found the wounded man. We did not know what we were finding." I said, "I know that." She said, "We found a dying white man in a wash with a hole in his back and no horse and no money and a bad smell. That is what we found." I said, "I appreciate the honesty." She said, "But I want to tell you something." I stopped working and looked at her. She said, "I have thought about it many times. What would have happened if we had walked past? If Natty had decided it was too much trouble?" She was looking at the mountains, not at me. "I have tried to imagine what my life would be if you had stayed in that wash." She shook her head slowly. "I cannot see it. I cannot see what I would be without the years that came after." She looked at me then. She said, "We found a dying man, but we found you." Just like that, plain as the rock under my boots and the blue sky above them. No performance, no sentiment, just a true thing said by a woman who knew the price of saying true things and was paying it anyway. I didn't say anything for a while. I held what she'd said. Then I went back to the fence. But I think she understood. I think she saw what was in my face. Because she stayed out there with me until I was done. And on the walk back to the house she walked close enough that her shoulder was against my arm, And when I put my hand on the back of her neck, just rested it there like I do, she leaned into it, a fraction, the way she does. That was all. The mountains above the ranch were still and blue in the late light. The goats were making goat sounds. Calico's old horse was at the fence watching us come in the way horses watch things, patient, unimpressed, just present. I went inside with my wife to the house we'd built. That's the story. That's what the law said was owed and what I found out in the paying of it. It wasn't easy and it wasn't fast, and I wouldn't trade it for anything that's ever been put in front of me. And I've had some things put in front of me. There's nothing else I need to add to that.